Avoiding attacks might be the most effective way of not taking damage, but unfortunately that's not always a possibility. If you keep moving away from your opponent, you are eventually going to have your back against a wall, metaphorical or literal. And even if you play on an infinite stage, you'll quickly realize that the developers don't want you to outrun an attacker, because that would make for a very boring fight. So moving away from your opponent is almost always going to be slower than moving towards them. Now imagine a scenario where your opponent catches up with you, you have nowhere else to go, and none of your moves will let you avoid the attack that's coming. What do? You do the thing you thought you didn't pay 60 or 70 bucks for. You block. It is often seen as a very passive phase of the gameplay loop, but there's a lot more to blocking than holding a button and waiting for the storm to pass. Statistically speaking, blocking is going to be your most used defensive option, but there's a reason why I spent a whole video talking about ways to avoid attacks before I got to blocking. Actually, there are 3 reasons. The first thing to understand about blocking is that not everything can be blocked. Most notably, throws cannot be blocked, as that is the very thing they are designed to beat. Other than that, some attacks in some games are unblockable, but that's relatively rare, and they almost always have an extremely slow startup. Some attacks will straight up knock you out of your blocking state, or in FGC term, they will guard crush you. Which attacks fit into the last 2 categories is something you're probably going to have to find out the hard way, unless the game is well documented. Second thing to understand about blocking is that in most games, you cannot block forever. Imagine the following scenario. The round starts, your opponent lands a lucky poke, and they now have the life lead, and proceed to block everything you throw at them until the timer runs out, giving them the W. That wouldn't be fun now, would it? Most fighting games developers think so too, so they tend to implement mechanics that make this scenario less likely. The simplest way they can do that is by charging you for blocking. You are given an allowance that gets depleted a bit every time you block an attack, but recharges when you do anything but. Most games that use such a mechanic will show the guard meter on the user interface, but others will only let you know when you're about to run out. Try to block when you've run out of that resource, and bad things happen. The effects vary depending on the game, but it ranges from temporarily losing some of your tools, which may include your ability to block, to being left at the mercy of a very damaging combo, sometimes both. Another way devs try to convince you to use defensive options that aren't blocking is by making blocking imperfect. What this means is that some attacks will deal a fraction of their damage even when blocked. This is called chip damage, because, it's chipping away at your health. Although the conditions in which that happens vary, chip damage can absolutely kill you, meaning you can die even if you block correctly. Remember one of the most famous video clips in fighting games history? Parrying all those attacks with such a tight timing is of course impressive, but what makes Moment 37 even more impressive is the fact that Daigo Umehara, the Ken player, had no choice but to parry everything, because he had no health left to spare, and in Third Strike, blocking anything in that situation would have meant death by chip damage. The third thing to understand about blocking is that what can be blocked needs to be blocked in a certain way. Whether the game uses back to block or a dedicated guard button, you'll have 2 types of block, standing block and crouching block. Each of these will protect you against different but overlapping sets of attacks, meaning you have to pick the right one for the attack, making blocking very much an active process. Although every attack's hitbox is in a different spot, all attacks are grouped into categories according to their height. There are 4 categories: low, mid, high, and overhead. Although most games only use 3 of them. Let's start with the obvious ones. Low attacks visually tend to target your character's lower limbs, and as you might be able to guess, if you're going to block them, you must use a crouching block. At the other end of the spectrum, overhead attacks, as the name should suggest, tend to come from above, and therefore must be blocked standing. You might draw the conclusion that all attacks that come from an airborne opponent are overhead, and you'd be right, most of the time. But even when that's not true, standing block should be a valid answer. Don't be like me and get the idea that you might be able to duck under overheads. They are designed to beat crouching opponents. It won't work. What you can duck under, however, is high attacks. This means that either block will work against highs, but crouching has the advantage of not resulting in block stun, since this is causing the attack to whiff. With the exception of Mortal Kombat and Injustice, high attacks do not exist in 2D fighters, despite what some games would have you believe. Which leaves us with the confusing world of mid attacks. In 2D games, mids are attacks that are neither low nor overhead, and make up the majority of a character's moveset. What's interesting about them from a defense point of view is that mids can be blocked either standing or crouching. In 3D games, however, mids are designed to beat crouching opponents, and so they must be blocked standing. For that reason, you will find that both attacks that aim roughly at the midsection of an average-sized character, as well as attacks that look like overheads, tend to be classified as mids. Let me repeat that because it was an epiphany for me as a beginner, and I don't hear many people mention it. In 3D fighters, overhead attacks, which tend to look like highs, are actually most likely mids. I know this is extremely counterintuitive, but you'll have to deal with it and remember it if you play 2D and 3D fighters side by side. Now, out of all those categories of attacks, there's always one in which the attacks tend to be much slower than the others. Slow enough that, in theory, you can react to them. In 2D games, it's usually overheads, and in 3D games, it's lows. What this means is that there is a type of block that covers both mids and the fast attacks, but not the reactable ones. That's why there is a recommended guard that should be your default. Some 2D games give you incentives to block mids with a standing guard, but the general advice is to pick the option that keeps you the safest. To summarize, in 2D games, you'll want to crouch block unless you see an overhead coming, and in 3D games, you'll want to stand block unless you see a low coming. Now, let's talk about what happens when you block an attack. We've already learned about block stun in episode 0, so there's no need to rehash that. But let's picture another very simple scenario. As you know, when an opponent hits you, the frame advantage is usually in their favor, meaning they can continue attacking before you recover. In other words, they are plus. Now, imagine your opponent backs you up in a corner and keeps hitting you with a move that's plus, even on block. Either you get hit once, and you'll be stuck in hit stun until you're dead, or you block, and you'll be stuck in block stun until the timer runs out. Neither situation would be fun, so to counter that, most games have something called Pushback. As the name suggests, every time an attack lands, whether it's blocked or not, one of the characters will get pushed further away from the other by a small amount. Do it enough times, and assuming the attack itself doesn't make you move forward, eventually the attack won't reach anymore, giving the opponent the chance to recover and do something. Very often, blocking will result in a greater pushback than when taking a hit, so there's another incentive to do that. As usual, there are exceptions to the rules, and some characters have moves that will pull you in rather than push you back, which are often used in combos. When a sequence of attacks gives the receiver no viable options other than to block, it is called a blockstring. A blockstring is said to have gaps if the defender exits block stun before the next attack becomes active. This is very common. However, the gap is often so short that even your fastest attack would be slower than your opponent's next attack, meaning that if you try to press a button in that gap, you are going to give your opponent a free hit on you, if not a free combo. This is why these gaps are often called frame traps, because you're being tricked into launching a counteroffensive when the better choice is generally to keep blocking. If a block string has no gaps, people will call it a true block string, where you really have no choice but to keep blocking because the next attack will land before you're out of block stun. When that happens, many games give you a hand without you realizing, with a mechanic colloquially known as absolute guard. If you block a hit in a true block string, the game will automatically keep blocking any subsequent attack, even if you let go of the controller, as long as there is no gap between the attacks. While I wouldn't recommend letting go of the block input just because you can, this is important to know because it means that while your opponent is sweating trying to land that combo they've been labbing, you need minimal brain power to keep yourself safe and have time to think about what to do next. Another thing to point out is that blocking offers you consistency. While making your opponent whiff an attack and then punishing it is one of the best things you can do, it's also harder to do consistently. You can misjudge the distance, you can get the timing wrong, or you can fuck up the input of your attack. When you're in block stun, you only need to worry about the last one, because if a move is punishable on block, it's consistently punishable. So that might be a reason to block rather than avoid an attack. Returning to the topic of pushback, there are games that give you some control over it. Mechanics such as Guilty Gear's Faultless Defense, or push blocking, as can be found in several games, can be used to increase the amount of pushback caused by blocking an attack, putting your opponent out of range much quicker, which may cause them to whiff. When a game implements such mechanics though, they usually don't let you do it for free, and it will cost you some resource, like some of your meter, so that you have to use this tool with consideration, especially as pushing the opponent further away might not always be what you want. How much pushback an attack causes is often proportional to how powerful it is. Powerful attacks also happen to be negative on block, but this pesky pushback might make them actually safe. It sure would be nice if you could punish those moves, right? That's why you might also find the game has mechanics that let you reduce pushback. A fairly common one is instant blocking. If you expect an incoming attack, you can press and hold the block input way early, and assuming that the type of block is appropriate for the attack, the game will do the rest for you. But if you block right when your opponent's attack hits, you will perform an instant block. This has many benefits, such as negating any chip damage or building meter, but the most valuable feature is often that instant block will reduce or even negate pushback, giving you more options to punish attacks that are negative on block. Because instant block requires you to let go of the block input for a bit, there is a slight risk of getting hit if you block too late, and trying to instant block too quickly might result in an accidental backdash. As usual, you have to balance the risks and the rewards. There's another mechanic that is very similar to instant blocking. Conceptually, parrying and instant blocking are the same: press some button when the incoming attack hits and get some benefit that's better than blocking. The main difference between the two is that the input required for parrying often completely prevents you from blocking, significantly increasing the risk of performing such a move, but you get a reward to match. In addition to removing pushback, a well-timed parry will have no block stun either, meaning you might be able to take your turn immediately. As you might be able to guess, the timing of such defensive options means that they are advanced and might be best left alone until you're familiar with the more straightforward options, but I'm including them for completeness. There's another type of parry that is more often than not character specific. Some moves will put the character into a state where if they get hit by an attack, they will automatically negate and maybe even punish it. These tend to have horrible recovery though. If your opponent notices what you're doing and refrains from attacking during the active period of the parry, you will be left wide open, so try not to become predictable with such moves. Finally, there is one broad category of defensive options that I will call the get off me moves, which are important for you to know about because these are the ones that let you get out of situations that seem inescapable. The common characteristic of such moves is that they usually don't lead into a combo. Their purpose is really just to get your opponent off your case so you can breathe and get back to a state where you have the opportunity to be the one doing the attacking. Probably the most important one is throw breaking, or sometimes called throw teching. Throws might be unblockable, but that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about being thrown. In the vast majority of games, once your opponent grabbed you, there is a short window of time where you can escape the throw, usually by inputting the throw command yourself. This will effectively cancel the opponent's throw animation and push them back far enough away that even some of their fastest attacks might not reach. That window, unfortunately, is often too short to be reactable, so you'll have to guess based on your opponent's patterns and playstyle. For instance, if your opponent casually walks towards you after knocking you down, the chances of a throw coming are significantly higher than if they keep their distance, especially if you don't have a lot of health left. But don't forget that high chance doesn't mean guarantee. And of course, not every throw can be broken. Notoriously, special and super moves that count as throw, also known as command throws, cannot be broken, and your only escapes are to either jump or backdash. Only experience, or Google searches, will teach you to tell the difference between a normal throw and a command throw, so get practicing. One type of get off me move I know many people would like to see in more games is the kind that lets you escape a combo. More specifically, these are about the ability to perform a defensive action while in hit stun. Of course, the grandparent of such moves is the aptly named combo breaker from Killer Instinct. I won't go into details since only KI does it the KI way, but in short, similar to how Tekken does throw breaks, you have to press the correct button to successfully break the combo, meaning you need to pay attention to what your opponent is doing even more than usual. Other games have implemented the idea in a simpler way, most notably Guilty Gear, which is where the name this mechanic is most commonly known as comes from, burst. Games with burst allow you to stop the combo you're currently eating, get out of hit stun, and push the opponent far enough away from you that they are forced to start their offense from scratch. Burst is often tied to a resource, so that you can't spam it, and more importantly, it can be blocked, meaning your opponent can bait the burst, aka luring you into activating it and then blocking it to regain the advantage. There's another mechanic that has a similar effect to burst, but is activated from block stun instead of hit stun. This is called a guard cancel. It usually requires you to let go of the blocking input to add an element of risk to it. In the same way burst breaks a potential combo, guard cancel breaks a block string, and might even do a bit of damage. Just like burst, guard cancels will often cost you something and might be blockable, so use it sparingly. For some reason, guard cancels tend to be underused in games that do feature the mechanic, and to be honest, I always forget when a game has it, but it is a good button to use when you get tired of someone's block string and would like to get a chance to attack without needing to know if your opponent is plus on block. In summary, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are many ways of negating incoming damage, each with its pros and cons, and which influence different parameters of the fight. At the end of the day, I'm not claiming that blocking is the most fun part of fighting, but if you're here because you want to play this game of fast-paced, real-time chess, you are leaving options on the table if you don't want to block or use block-like defensive options. After all, that is included in the price of the game. Following on from the last episode, the goal here is to still increase the time it takes to die, and with that, I think I have covered the most common defensive options you will find in fighting games in order to achieve that goal. Next time, we'll finally start talking about getting on the offensive. See you then!